to lecture 1.2, uncertainties and errors. So you need to remember that any measurement we make in science, although we're going to try and be as perfect as we can, will have some level of uncertainty. This happens because, well, even if we can make better and better tools, all the way down to kind of the actual physical measurements of things, atoms like to shake around, and it's very hard to find the edges of them. And so there's never any kind of true certainty in science. And so what we're going to talk about today is how do you represent all those uncertainties and natural inabilities to be perfect because we aren't perfect humans. So let's get started. Uncertainties. For every measurement, the uncertainty is the expected range for someone who repeats the measurements. So for example, if you measured right here and the true value is somewhere here, if you quote that you think, well, my uncertainty, yeah, I measured this number, but it could be this much bigger or this much smaller, you would encompass the true value and hopefully any other value that someone else in your group or another scientist might measure. And so we're always going to have this plus a certain amount and minus a certain amount on our numbers. And so when we talk about precision and accuracy in our labs, we're talking about very specific things. So precision is when the uncertainty of a measurement is low, which means that you've used really great tools and the amount you would expect another person with that same tool to measure is very low off of what you measured. And so you need the right tool to do this. You can't measure someone's height using like 1 meter off in the distance. You need to be using something right up in their face and measure the little scales on there. And so when we talk about precise, we mean that there's low range, meaning everything's close together. Not precise would be a big spread of all the data. And so even if you are precise, it might not be what you wanted, which is an error. And so when we talk about accuracy, we talk about being on the true value. So for example, if I know I weigh 80 kilograms and I go and place myself on a scale and I measure it at 100, I know there's some sort of an error. And so what are some types of errors you're going to find in all of your kind of experiments? Because these are things that you're going to do in your analysis. You're going to talk about your errors. And so there's two important types of errors you need to think about. The first kind is always going to show up in your lab. There is always going to be these. They're called random errors. They're unavoidable, small differences in any measurement by a scientist. The second kind is actually avoidable, and we're going to try to avoid them as much as we can, but sometimes we do a whole lab and we figure out at the end, crap, something was wrong. These are called systematic errors, and you want to look for them in your analysis. So the first kind of errors there are special kinds of them that you want to talk about when you're doing your analysis, especially in your IA. So a random error that happens in every experiment is what we call readability. So on the scales, you have a certain number of tick marks and divisions in the tool that you can't go smaller than, otherwise you're guessing. So for example, in this one, if we're talking about milliliters, you can guess like the in-between, the like halves of millimeters, the tenths of millimeters, but you have to guess at some point. So if this water was right on the dot, I'm guessing that it's right on this line, right? It could be slightly above it. If I had a zoom in better tool, I could maybe see that I'm not exactly on this line. So I'm guessing at some point that it's like this number plus 0 or minus 0. And so there's always going to be some kind of readability error. For a hand tool like this scale, you're going to do plus or minus half of whichever tick marks are the smallest. So for example, on a meter stick, you go all the way down to millimeters, so it's plus or minus half of a millimeter or 0.0005. I think I might have added a 0. Yeah, we can talk about that. And then on a digital tool like a scale, if I measure myself to be 80.3 kilograms, I can be plus or minus that last digit I could see, that 0.3. So I'll do plus 80.3 plus or minus 0.1 kilograms. And then for another kind of error you're going to run into is the one they're showing in this picture. If you are looking at a scale from an angle, which almost all the time you're going to have some sort of a parallax error, you're going to be reading from the wrong position and possibly reading too high or too low. This is if you can't get right in line with the scale, it's going to happen very often. And honestly, even if you get your eyeball down to the scale, you might be still off a little bit. So this parallax error will happen in almost every single lab. The last kind won't happen in every single lab, but it is often happening. It's called human reaction, and this is when you're timing. So when you're trying to time something using a timer, humans, their eyeballs take a second to process it before their brain tells their hand to do something, and all of that takes time. And so there's some sort of an error, and you can check how big your error is by trying to start and stop the stopwatch as fast as you can. There is some sort of a time delay, and this is what we call human reaction. All right, the other kinds of errors, the ones you want to avoid if you can, are called systemic errors. And these can happen inside of tools, and they can be unavoidable sometimes too. The only one that we can identify by name, and the only one you're ever going to put in your analysis, is called a zero offset error. This is when the tool isn't reading zero before you even start measuring. It's like if you step on that bathroom scale and it says you're already 5 pounds, well, then you know that you're off by 5 pounds whenever you measure yourself. So either you can set it back to zero by calibrating it, or you can just, after the fact, adjust all of your numbers to reflect that difference. Any other systematic errors? Sorry, that's a hard word for me, and I think I wrote it wrong on the slide. Any other systematic errors that happen while you're doing any measurement, you'll find when you go to graph your stuff, and you won't get the intercept you're expecting. So for example, if you're running a race and you get a bunch of times for your distances and you plot them out, if your intercept's not 0, 0 when you started on the 0 line at time 0, then something went wrong, right? Either the person wasn't timing correctly or something was off at some point in the experiment. And so that would be called a systematic error. All right, so how can we reduce some errors and get the best possible answers? So whenever possible, you're going to repeat measurements for a minimum of 3 to 5 times to make sure that your measurement is correct. Also, having a partner to check your measurements is going to make things way better too. You want to throw out any measurement that is unusual. In science, we call those anomalies, or any measurement that you know is wrong. So for example, if you were trying to measure something falling and all of a sudden someone bumped it, well, that's probably wrong and you should just redo it. Unless it's super difficult to redo the experiment, you want to redo any trials where you know you messed up. How would you present these uncertainties on your measurements when you're actually writing down your data? So the first thing you're going to write down is your absolute uncertainty. So this is the range above and below that I talked about that you quote when you quote a value. So for example, right when I was measuring the marker, I measured that it was 8.05 centimeters, but I can measure to millimeters, so it's plus or minus 0.05 centimeters. So 8.05 plus or minus 0.05 centimeters. Yes. And so that's what you would quote. And then the fractional uncertainty is something that you're going to want to figure out in order to do uncertainty calculations. So a fractional uncertainty is just taking your absolute uncertainty and dividing it by what number you quoted. So for example, right, with this little marker, I would take my 0.05 uncertainty and divide it by the 8.05 value to know what my fractional uncertainty is. And then last but not least, if you become an engineer, they like to use percent uncertainties, which is when you turn the fraction uncertainty into a percentage by multiplying by 100. So why did I say you have to calculate uncertainties? Well, if all of a sudden I'm taking the length of this marker and maybe I measure the width too to find the volume or area, well, all of a sudden now the uncertainty in my measurement this way is going to be adding to the uncertainty in my measure this way, and they're going to compound on each other. And they compound in a very specific way. And we're going to have this in our data booklet, so you don't have to memorize it, but you might do it enough that you'll get pretty used to it. And so if you're adding two numbers that are uncertain, like a height or like two distances, you're going to just add the uncertainties. If you're multiplying them, you're going to multiply, or dividing, you're going to multiply the fractional uncertainties together. You're going to add those together, and that's going to be equal to the fractional uncertainty of your answer. So this equation will be super useful when we're doing those. And last but not least, if you're doing an exponent, it's basically the multiplication one, but as you know, exponents are just multiplying the same number over and over again. So it's this equation. And so we are going to have to practice that before it makes sense to you. But I'm just showing you up front that it's something that you're going to do. And I hope that this lecture helped you. The last thing that we need to do is we need to graph these uncertainties. And so graphs show up on uncertainties show up in what we call error bars. I will make a whole lecture on how to do error bars because they're very confusing. But basically, when you know your uncertainty in your range of numbers, what you would expect someone else to measure in, you are going to do plus or minus that amount on your data point that you represent on a graph. And so they show up like this. You can see there's error bars going up and down and left and right because you have error in both your time and your distance. So both of them show up. And then something that IB wants you to do, and it's kind of a relic before we had computer programs that could help us with our error analysis, but I will show you how to do it just because it shows up on the IB test every now and then, is something called maximum and minimum gradient lines. So a maximum gradient is just the steepest slope that you could get to pass through every single error bar. And so if you see in this picture, the maximum gradient is this line. That is the steepest line that could possibly pass through both of these error bars. And although you're going to say it's not actually going through the bars, it's going through the area that they combine to. So it's going to this corner and this corner. That is the maximum gradient. The minimum gradient is going to be the shallowest slope that goes through the error bars. So it's going to be this line going through here. And those two lines are created usually if you're doing something by hand to help you create a line of best fit, because the best fit line should be right in between those two. And so you can figure out also how uncertain your best fit line is. Because if this could be the steepest line and this is the shallowest line, then somewhere in between there is my correct answer. And this will be my range that I quote for my plus and minus on my slope. And so all of these, again, like I said, they take a lot of practice and they don't really make sense until you actually do them in practice. So I am lecturing about it, but we'll come back to them all the time in our other topics. So hopefully this helps you. This is topic 1.2, and I'll come back to it.